Well, one of the important things is that natural selection is a real process, and we're not denying that. And Diane has alluded to that, that it is a real process, but it's based on existing genetic variation and existing genetic information that's out there in various populations. But evolution requires changes in that genetic information, and they say it happens by mutations. And the mutations can only happen in the reproductive cells. So it's not a change, in the genetic information within your various body cells. It's only in the reproductive cells, and they're chance variations, they're chance mutations. So if we can just go to my slides, thanks, Sam. So I have shown this in the past, but this is a sign at the Melbourne Museum that is talking about evolution, natural selection, and so on, and it gets on to mutations, and it says that they're marvelous mistakes. Now, my wife, her broader family, sort of cousins and everything, my wife had to get checked that she didn't have a particular mutation that was in the genes of the broader family, and she doesn't have it, thankfully, but it's caused devastating impacts in the family. It has killed a lot of people in the broader family, and there's no one in the broader family that's saying that these mutations are marvelous. And in fact, nobody that that I know of that has been subject to genetic mutation would call those mistakes marvelous. And they are mistakes. And it's really interesting to me that our whole genetic system, our whole DNA system is built around trying to stop mistakes happening. If mistakes are the way things evolve and supposedly improve, you'd think that over time there'd be a system of mistakes being the norm. But it's not the norm. It's a mistake, and it's not meant to happen. So I'll just see if I can click that through. But as Glenn really brought this up, what does the science really show us? What is the science about this? And there's been a number of scientists that have actually become Christians through looking at the science alone. And John has brought up the fruit fly. Well, researchers believe that this creature has been around for 40 million years. And this is a creature that can breed many generations in a single year. It can breed over 20 generations in a single year. And here we have a fruit fly after 40 million years. It has the most generations of, most organisms, maybe aside from some of the bacteria and so on, but it's still a fruit fly. And what have researchers actually found? They found that over 600 generations of bred fruit flies have, yes, mutations have been involved, but the mutations in the core developmental genes resulted in what? Highly evolved fruit flies changing into something else? No, the science actually shows us that they become either deformed or they die. They're dead or deformed. That's what the science shows us. So the experimental evidence is against natural selection leading to evolution. And indeed, bacteria has been looked at as well, where tens of thousands of generations have been observed. And what does it lead to? Does it lead to bacteria evolving into something else or to highly evolved and improved bacteria? No. It results in defective bacteria with accumulated mutations. What are mutations? Mutations are mistakes. So that's our conclusion. We have to come from the science that experimental evidence is against natural selection leading to evolution. And the scientists, as we've already had a number of quotes from scientists from our other speakers, really brings this out. So when they're honest, they know that this is true. And this was in the Guardian article, which we've brought up once or twice on Creation Conversations over the last couple of years. But Stephen Barany, who's from the Imperial College in London, wrote quite an honest article, I believe, for on this debate amongst biologists that evolution is just not answering the question on evolution. And he says, for one thing, it starts midway through the story, taking for granted the existence of light-sensitive cells, lenses, and irises without explaining where they came from in the first place. So they're admitting they don't know where this genetic complexity can come from, and that natural selection, evolution, is a result of using existing genetic information. And he goes on to quote a biologist from Indiana University, Armin Moshek. He says this: the first eye, the first wing, the first placenta, how they emerge. Explaining these is the foundational motivation of evolutionary biology, and yet we still do not have a good answer. The classic idea of gradual change, one happy accident at a time, has so far fallen flat. They've got no idea, and that's because their underlying foundational principles are wrong. There is a creator. The organisms have been created with incredible complexity and genius, and any natural selection that we see is a variation of what has been created. Now, Charles Darwin actually compared natural selection directly to domestic selection, and he was a pigeon breeder, and he connected the idea of natural selection. So there's got to be selection forces. In domestic selection, the selection force is people choosing the features they want in an organism. In natural selection, it just so happens those selection pressures come from nature. So cold, hot, lots of rain, not much water, and so on. And obviously other organisms interacting with the creature that we're looking at. But we know that domestic selection ultimately leads to specialization and therefore increased disease risk in the progeny. We know that. Just think of highly bred species of dogs that ultimately they can run a risk of diseases and certain sorts of problems. Natural selection does the same thing, and I've had evolutionary scientists say it to me personally, that it leads to specialization in an organism, but not a new type of organism. So as Glenn presented, things reproduce after their kind. There is no explanation of how complex new genetic information arises in the first place. So another conclusion that we can make is that natural selection leads to specialization and risk of degradation of the existing gene pool, and that can lead to increased risk of extinction. So John's a big orchid fan. Orchids, for example, can become very specialized in a natural environment, such to the point where you might only find certain species of orchids in very, very limited locations. And if that location is impacted, then that variety of orchid becomes extinct. Simple as that. And that happens in the plant kingdom a lot, where various varieties have, through natural selection, can survive in a very specific environment. But if that environment is impacted by fire, by disease, by a quarry or something, then that entire organism becomes extinct. It's not upward improving evolution. So a local example we have in Tassie is the Tasmanian devil, and it has this terrible facial tumour disease. Only in the 20-odd years since I've lived in Tasmania has this come about, so it's a very modern problem. But the recent news is actually good, that the University of Tasmania, which is UTAS there, they report that their research is showing the devils appear to be evolving naturally in response to devil facial tumour disease. As such, the gene frequencies in natural populations are likely to differ from those in captive populations. So what they've done is they've taken a whole bunch of devils and put them in captive breeding programs around the country, and those captive breeding populations are geared towards maximising the overall genetic diversity. So what they're actually admitting in that statement is that the devils that are surviving in the wild have a reduced genetic variability. The devils had to have had the capability to survive already the disease, otherwise there'd be no devils, right? But how do they get around this? Well, they say that they've witnessed fast evolution in action and an increasing number of individuals with tumour regressions. Now, this is good news. I think it's fantastic that the devils are actually surviving, starting to survive in the wild against this disease. But have they really evolved? They can now, they've evolved this capacity to eliminate the cancer on their own. Well, what the devils have done is use their existing immune system, which is already incredibly complex. It has many, many genes involved. It's not just one gene that's somehow quickly mutated and evolved as a mistake randomly. No. What's happened is that they're using an existing complex immune system, and some of them just have that capacity to defeat this disease. They're passing it on to their offspring, and that smaller part of the population has actually got a lower genetic diversity than the ones in captive breeding populations. So this sort of supports the very points that we're making. Now, just to move on quickly to a couple of the finds that I made during the week. Again, it's Permian, similar to what we've been finding in the Permian rocks in Tassie. It was late in the day. I'd spent quite a few hours searching, but it was good to find these. Scallops, this is Permian rock. It's over 200 million years old according to the evolutionary timescales, and yet scallops continue to be scallops. So my question is this: if you're really honest with yourself and you believe that evolution is something that happens with gradual changes over time in response to selection, you can't argue to me that over 200 million years there hasn't been a lot of environmental changes and pressures on organisms. Then over 200 million years, scallops have produced scallops and haven't changed at all. You've got to ask yourself, is evolution a process that's really happening? The brachiopod up in the top left there is an extinct one. So specialization, extinction, can't handle the changes in the environment. That's not evolution, that's extinction. Mm-hmm. And this was another lovely fossil that I found. I just cracked it open there, and it's got a nice sort of slab and counter slab of a bryozoan called Stenopora or Stenopora. And that's another creature, Permian rock again, supposedly over 200 million years, but they're still alive today. There's a modern one in comparison. So you still have these creatures. They haven't evolved at all. There might be slight variations within their kind, but certainly no evolution. Well, as was raised, if evolution is just changing an organism, well, maybe you can call it evolution, but that's the trouble with the term evolution. It's a very slippery term.